All right, thank you so much for that. And here are some of the bullet points of this ceasefire and hostage deal confirmed by the United States and Qatar. The ceasefire will begin on Sunday, just a day ahead of that inauguration, as both parties, both administrations, significantly impacted, had a hand in this. The deal will be implemented in 3 phases. The first phase includes a prisoner exchange. 2 American hostages will be released during that first phase, and it will last some 42 days, some 6 weeks. All right, let's continue on here on Live Now from Fox. Bring in retired Marine Intelligence Officer, national security expert Hal Kempfer, and also my colleague Andrew Kraft. Thanks, guys, for joining us here. Hal, this was a big day, a monumental day. What are our big takeaways from what happened with the ceasefire deal?
Well, Andy, I think the biggest thing is that they actually got the deal done. I have to tell you, as of this morning, when I was looking at it, there was a lot of pushback in Netanyahu's coalition. One of his cabinet members, or coalition members, cabinet members, essentially, one of his ministers was basically said, look, if you do this deal, I'm leaving. And if he left, the coalition would have collapsed. But I think what actually made the biggest point there was that President-elect Trump, all right, not to get partisan on this, but President-elect Trump basically pulled in some markers, if you will, said, hey, look, we moved the embassy, meaning the administration or the first term, moved the embassy to Jerusalem during my first term. That was a big deal, referenced some other things. And I think that kind of pressure was something that Netanyahu was able to communicate to build some consensus. That was enough to kind of get it over the finish line, if you will, for phase 1. And I think that's the thing to point out is we have an agreement on phase 1, but phase 1 is when the follow-on agreements are phase 2 and 3 is figured out. And the thing I would point out is there is a lot to work out for phase 2 and 3, and they've got to get all of those hostages released. And last time we had a ceasefire, towards the end, they started running out of hostages, or they weren't able to find the hostages. I'm kind of wondering, as they get into like the upper 20s, low 30s numbers, if they're going to be able to find those hostages, or if they're going to have some problems. And if they do, I have a feeling that Netanyahu may kind of do exactly what he did the first time, and we may not see a phase 2 implemented.
Hal, I wanted to ask you, and I just want to take stock of this moment because, Hal, you and I have devoted hours to this very topic over the last 15 months. And it is kind of staggering and emotional to think that something has finally been reached after so many failed iterations. So I just wanted to take stock of that because it is quite groundbreaking here. But that leads to the next question, to what you were alluding to. Can it hold? And will it hold? 42 days in phase 1 is a long time. And you and I, Hal, have talked so much about the perceived successes and or failures of the diplomatic approach and the diplomatic route here. Did diplomacy win today? Did the arc of diplomacy win out or not? Was this just the incoming Trump administration's strong-arming the Netanyahu government into accepting this deal? Or is it both?
Andrew, that's interesting. I was pondering that today too. Was this a success for diplomacy, or was this something else? Obviously, to get any deal in an international setting like this, considering the negotiations that have been going on, yeah, to some extent, it has to be considered a success for diplomacy. But I'd like to take it one more step and say this. This really gets into bare-knuckle politics as well. What was going on there was some strong-arming. It was strong-arming across the board. It was the U.S. kind of strong-arming, or at least Trump strong-arming Netanyahu. I think the Biden administration was probably doing a little strong-arming as well. Everybody was strong-arming Hamas. And so I think there was just some, basic political dynamics, if you will, to get this thing across the board. And I think some of the more nuanced diplomacy that we sometimes think of, I don't think that made as much an impact as some of the very direct language that's taken place over the last week or so.
Yeah, of course, that coming from a speech from President Trump at Mar-a-Lago just a week ahead of his inauguration. I do want to ask that, and I also want to ask that in the context of this post on social media from Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, says he spoke this evening with President-elect Donald Trump, thanked him for his assistance in advancing the release of the hostages and for helping Israel bring to an end the suffering of dozens of hostages and their families. He goes on on social media, saying Prime Minister made it clear that he's committed to returning all the hostages however he can, and commended the U.S. President-elect for his remarks that the U.S. would work with Israel to ensure that Gaza would never be a haven for terrorism. Two decided to meet in Washington soon in order to discuss this and other important issues. Netanyahu then spoke with U.S. President Joe Biden and thanked him as well for his assistance in advancing the hostage deal. And maybe just the nature of the fact that he spoke to Trump first and then Biden alludes to some of what we were just talking about. I want to ask you from the perspective of the Israeli people talking about this. We talked to Jonathan Shanzer over the FDD saying it was a sense of relief in Israel. Are they happy with this deal in Israel?
I think at this point they'd be happy with any deal. They just want to get the hostages back. I think there's just a sense of exhaustion with the Israeli public with the hostages, just never able to close the deal. Certainly, as Andrew and I, as Andrew alluded to, we've talked about this many times, and Andy, you and I've talked about this on the air as well, about all these times that they got close and then it just fell through. So I think the fact that they got this in place, finally done, of course, you know, the big thing is the timing of it had less to do with anything going on in the Middle East and probably more to do with the inauguration of the U.S. president coming up, you know, in just a few days. And that was really the big push. And, you know, certainly, you know, when the president-elect is saying words like there'll be hell to pay, I have a feeling that there was probably a lot of other communications that went to Hamas where that hell to pay thing was articulated in very graphic terms as to what this means, which was basically, if this war is still in effect, don't expect the U.S. to be basically a countering force with Israel, that there will be a much stronger tone, if you will. And I think that's what Hamas got. Now, with that said, I should say one thing. I don't think Hamas really as much as we tend to build up our the terrorists and the enemies as being so clever, whatever that says, terrorists do really stupid stuff sometimes from a strategic standpoint. And the fact that Hamas is out there chanting victory, we won, stuff like that, maybe they need that for their own self-actualization in terms of validating the fact that Hamas is not quite done. But I have to tell you, that there's a different audience with certainly Netanyahu and his cabinet, and a different audience with the Israeli people when they hear that. And that's why I'm going to watch and see what happens with the phase 2 negotiations, because Hamas is kicking this thing off by saying probably the very thing they should not be saying publicly, and that's exactly what they're saying.
So, Hal, this is simplistic to say, but it is true. Elections matter, and I thought it was so interesting that maybe I don't want to speak for you, but I really didn't see this coming at the forefront of a new U.S. administration in 5 days, that would be the linchpin to secure a deal, because to your point, we have been in this position, I think it was nearing 12 or 13 times, and then at the 11th hour, Hamas would ultimately reject the deal. So I have to ask you this about Hamas. What are they getting out of this? You were intimating some type of propaganda victory, but yes, the war isn't over. It's paused for 42 days. There will be Hamas fighters still left in Gaza. Do they reconstitute themselves? Is there any semblance of a political structure that they still have? What are they going to do for these 42 days if they don't violate the deal?
Oh, I think you hit the nail on the head. Andrew, I think what they're going to do is they're going to use this time to reconstitute. They're recruiting, actually, surprisingly, under Mohammed Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar's brother, who took over Hamas. Their recruiting effort has actually been very successful. They've actually, for them, success means they're recruiting more Hamas members than they're actually losing to Israeli combat, deaths in Israeli combat every day. So they actually were gaining some numbers. So they're going to use this pause to basically try and reconstitute as best they can. They'll also probably try to use this time to reconstitute whatever they have as far as political control over the Gaza Strip, develop whatever they, I don't know if develop, but resurrect whatever logistics capability they have, their lines of communication, whatever they can do. I think Hamas is, from a Hamas goal, what do they want to do? They just want to survive, and they want to exist as a cohesive organization that controls Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. That's really what their big goal is. For the Israelis, that's absolutely what they do not want to see. And so I think, both sides have said, look, we got to get this hostage thing resolved. We got to do this. And I think for Netanyahu, he's saying, look, he got enough pressure from certainly Biden and definitely from Trump that he had to get this thing in place. But I imagine behind closed doors in this coalition, there's a very frank discussion on where this goes from here. And one of the things is that they're not going to give up their goals of Hamas not having governance of Gaza or being a military threat to Israel. And I think that's just a hard and fast. That will not move with the Israeli position.
And where this goes from here, that's going to be a big component of that after that 6 weeks, if we are peaceful for that amount of time. I want to ask you about the hostages that are being released, 2 American hostages as well. And of course, you mentioned the fact that they will try to find all these hostages, Hamas trying to send some of them back as well. But if they have to send back bodies as well, there's going to be a lot of emotion, a somber time for that. How much can that factor into this? And knowing that as the hostages are released, they will also have stories to tell. How much can you learn from hostages, and how much will that dynamic impact what we see, like you mentioned, beyond just phase 1?
Oh, I think they're gonna garner or glean a phenomenal amount of intelligence in terms of what's been happening with these hostages, where they've been held. There is a strategic debriefing process that all the hostages will go through. There is a very set piece thing where they come back, the repatriation, how they meet their loved ones, everything else. But then there is also a very detailed, very lengthy debriefing process to gather as much intelligence. And the thing you have to remember, the hostages can get moved around. So the faster they can debrief, the hostages coming back, the higher quality the intelligence they're going to get. And they're going to try and build up a picture of where they are. They'll also try to develop, I know it sounds kind of strange, but a hostage taker, if you will, pattern of life. Basically try to figure out, how is Hamas operating? What is their tactics, techniques, procedures with handling the hostages, and basically build up an intelligence picture of how they're doing this, so they can anticipate where Hamas might move these hostages or what they might do in the future. And of course, one thing they have to plan for, certainly the Israeli Defense Forces plan for this, Shin Bet's planning for this, is what if phase 2 never comes? And if that's the case, I would expect, if they have a pretty good idea where the hostages are, you would see a series of highly coordinated operations to rescue hostages the moment they could. And to your point, with if some of the hostages turn out not to be live hostages, but they start trying to substitute bodies, I imagine the rhetoric's going to get very strong, very quick, and I would not be surprised. And I think that Netanyahu has this in the back of his mind. The plan is, if they fail, if they stumble, to say Hamas broke the agreement, but that's something he's going to have to also negotiate. I think that's one of the reasons he's going to meet with what will be President Trump at the time. That's why he wants to meet with him, because I think they want to have that frank discussion behind closed doors, where they explore the what if scenario, and he gets the U.S. behind whatever Israel is planning to do or might have to do.
So, Hal, I don't think it's non-common knowledge that the Israeli body politic is emotionally broken, and has been, over the hostage question. And so this is good news. This breakthrough is very good news. We've seen just protests and demonstrations in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv today of sheer elation. But going back to the outset of the war and the aims Netanyahu had set for the war, because war is about winners and losers. And the aims at that time were to release all the hostages and get them back safe, and to completely decimate and extirpate Hamas from the face of the earth, from the Gaza Strip. Those 2 aims still have not come to fruition and are not done in Netanyahu's mind. So when you talk about winners and losers today, the war still goes on, right?
It's still going on until they stop fighting on Sunday, as near as I can tell. In fact, I just saw where they had more strikes coming in. So there's still action going on. I imagine they're going to be watching what's going on in the Gaza Strip very closely. I would imagine if there's an opportunity that they think they could rescue some hostages between now and Sunday, they might try and do something like that. Sometimes in situations you'll find that your enemy will do things that they normally wouldn't do that show their hand, and it'll provide opportunities on the battlefield. And that's exactly what I think the IDF is hoping, and certainly Shin Bet is hoping as well in that. Now, as far as eliminating Gaza or the Hamas, I don't know if they want to extirpate them from the face of the earth completely. They did actually throw out some options of moving them to other countries, which I thought was interesting. One of the countries they talked about was moving them to Sudan, which I found absolutely fascinating, considering what the situation is on the ground in Sudan, which is you're going to go from Gaza to Sudan. I'm like, well, that's something. That's kind of like in World War II, saying you're going to go from the Eastern Front with Russia, if you're a Nazi, to fighting in the islands of the Pacific alongside your Japanese allies. It's like, well, that's going to be a really interesting move. So I didn't see that as it wasn't a complete elimination, but I don't know if that was a serious move. Yeah.
Hal, my point was, though, even with this breakthrough, with this piece of good news, does it still underscore the point that those two war aims and goals are still in contradiction or in conflict?
I think to some extent, yeah, there is a little bit of cognitive dissonance with where we are right now, because Hamas remains. Hamas, the fact that a deal was struck with Hamas means that they've had to acknowledge Hamas' existence, and this has been the constant problem. And you and I have talked about this on the air, which is Hamas is basically in an existential negotiation, which is they want to survive whatever this turns into, whatever comes out of this. So they're going to try and do this. Now, what will be interesting is if they do proceed with a phase 2 and phase 3, and if Hamas is allowed to reconstitute to a certain extent, and if they are still a significant force du jour, if you will, within the Gaza Strip, that will be very, very difficult politically, I think, for Netanyahu, because it is such a contrast with the stated aims of what this was when this thing started, that I just don't know. And then again, Netanyahu is an amazing political survivor, but I just don't know how his regime would stay together if Hamas was to somehow come back as a governing element in Gaza when this is all done. And I think I see that as the big rub here, which is, how do you do this? I mean, how do you negotiate at the end that Hamas is not a military force or a paramilitary force or a terrorist threat to Israel, is not a governing thing, and you get all the hostages back, and then you rebuild the Gaza Strip? There's a lot of big hurdles that they have to work through, and I think it's going to be a very tough 6 weeks.
Yeah, just the next 42 days, all eyes on this. But the last 400+ days, all these hostages in captivity, very, very difficult to comprehend since that October 7th attack. Hal, thank you again. I appreciate it. A big day there with the ceasefire deal, hostage deal being reached. We appreciate you.